My parents said my wedding wasn't worth their time. My own mother looked me in the eye and said, "A backyard wedding is a waste for someone like you." Then, on the same day I walked myself down the aisle, they flew to Hawaii with my perfect sister and her children. No call, no text, not even a fake excuse. That night, still in my wedding dress, I opened Facebook and saw them smiling on a beach, raising glasses under the caption, "Perfect vacation with the people who matter most." The people who matter most. I stared at those words until my hands went numb. They hadn't missed my wedding. They had chosen to replace it. I should have blocked them right then. But daughters like me don't stop hoping all at once. We stop slowly, one heartbreak at a time. Then, 1 week later, my father called, not to apologize, not to ask if I was happy. He called because he needed $40,000. 3 years earlier, he had begged me to co-sign a loan for his investment property. I said yes because I was desperate for one thing I had chased my whole life: his approval. Now the payments were late. The bank was threatening foreclosure, and because my name was on the loan, I was in danger too. "Family helps family," he said. I almost laughed. Where was family when I stood in front of 2 empty chairs at my own wedding? Where was family when they toasted in Hawaii to the people who mattered most? So I took a breath and said the words they never expected to hear from me. "Don't call me about things you said were worthless." Then I hung up. That was the day I stopped begging to be loved by people who only valued me when they needed something. To understand why that phone call changed me, you need to understand the house I grew up in. From the outside, the Hammond family looked perfect. We lived in a white colonial house, just outside Boston, with black shutters, polished windows, and a lawn my mother treated like it was part of our family reputation. My father, Richard Hammond, was a senior partner at a respected law firm. My mother, Evelyn, managed a large hospital and chaired charity events, where people praised her elegance, her discipline, and her ability to make everything appear flawless. Then there was my older sister, Melissa. Melissa was the daughter my parents knew how to love out loud. She had perfect grades, perfect manners, perfect ambition. She won science medals, debate trophies, scholarships, and later became the surgeon my parents had practically announced she would become before she was even old enough to drive. When my mother said Melissa's name, her voice changed. It became warmer, brighter, proud in a way I spent most of my childhood trying to earn. I was different. I was quiet, observant, more interested in colors, faces, and the way sunlight moved across the walls than in test scores or polished achievements. My mother called me creative, but she said it with the same tone people used when they were trying to be kind about a disappointment. At dinner parties, if someone asked about me, she would smile and say, "Claire has always been very creative." Then she would quickly turn the conversation back to Melissa's latest award, Melissa's school project, Melissa's future in medicine. I learned early that a person could be present in a room and still feel invisible. As a child, I thought love had rules, and Melissa had simply learned them before I did. She knew how to make my parents proud. She knew what to say, how to stand, what to pursue, and which accomplishments were worth displaying. I tried in my own way. I drew pictures, wrote little stories, collected leaves because I liked the tiny veins running through them. I noticed things no one else seemed to notice. But none of those things had value in my parents' world. When I was 9, I won first place in a town art contest. My drawing was displayed in the local library for a month. I remember standing there with my blue ribbon in my hands, waiting for my mother to look proud. She glanced at the drawing for a few seconds and said, "That's nice, Claire." Then she turned to Melissa and asked her to tell my father about her math score. That was the entire celebration. I folded the ribbon carefully when we got home and hid it in the back of my drawer, beside other small proofs that I had tried to be seen. The memory that stayed with me most happened when I was 6. Melissa had received an academic trophy at school, and my mother was glowing. She fixed Melissa's hair, adjusted her collar, and took picture after picture of her standing with my father. I had received a certificate too, for most improved in Reading. It was not as shiny as Melissa's trophy, but I was proud of it. I walked up to my mother while she was holding the camera and asked if I could have a hug. She did not even turn toward me. "Not now, Claire. Don't ruin the shot." I lowered my arms and stepped back. No one noticed. My father kept smiling at Melissa. My mother kept taking pictures. I stood near the edge of the gym, with my certificate pressed against my chest, trying to pretend the words had not hurt. Years later, that photo still hung in the hallway of my parents' house. Melissa stood in the center, bright and sharp, trophy in hand. My parents stood around her, like she was the answer to every hope they had ever had. I was in the far corner of the picture, blurry and half turned away, still holding my certificate. That photograph became the perfect summary of my place in the family. I was there, but never central. Visible, but only if someone bothered to look closely. By high school, I had stopped bringing home every drawing or award. I had stopped waiting for my parents to ask about my day. Instead, I became very good at watching. I watched my mother's face light up when Melissa spoke. I watched my father lean forward when Melissa talked about college applications. I watched relatives ask my sister serious questions about her future, then turn to me and say, "Still doing your little art thing?" I smiled because it was easier than explaining how much that question hurt. Then, one summer, my Uncle Jeff visited and handed me an old Canon camera in a worn leather case. The strap was cracked, the body scratched, and the lens had a tiny mark near the edge. To anyone else, it probably looked outdated and useless. To me, it felt like possibility. "You're the artistic one," he said. "Maybe you'll know what to do with this." For once, being called artistic did not feel like an insult. I did not understand the camera at first. My early photos were too dark, too bright, crooked, blurred, but I loved the process. I loved waiting for a moment, instead of forcing one. I loved framing ordinary things until they looked meaningful. A woman laughing at a bus stop, two old men playing chess in the park, a child pressing both hands against a bakery window, sunlight falling across empty church pews. Behind the camera, I felt invisible in a way that did not hurt. I could choose what mattered. I could decide what belonged inside the frame. My art teacher, Miss Reynolds, noticed before anyone at home did. One afternoon, after reviewing a set of black and white photos I had taken near the Charles River, she looked at me and said, "Claire, you don't just take pictures. You understand silence. That's rare." I held on to those words for years because they were the first words that made my way of seeing the world feel like a gift instead of a flaw. At home, the camera was treated like another phase. My father saw me cleaning the lens at the kitchen table one night and told me not to let photography distract me from real plans. My mother called it an obsession. She said I spent too much time alone, that I was hiding from the world, that I needed to think about a practical future. They never asked what I saw through the lens. They only worried about what it would fail to provide. Status, stability, something impressive enough to mention at dinner parties. During my senior year, I entered a statewide photography competition without telling them. The photo I submitted was simple: an elderly woman feeding birds near the river just after sunrise. The light caught the birds mid-flight, and the woman's face looked calm, almost sacred. I did not expect to win, but I did. First place. My photo was printed in a local youth art section, with my name underneath it, Claire Hammond. For one afternoon, I carried that newspaper around like proof I existed. When I showed it to my mother, she was unloading the dishwasher. She glanced at the article, said, "That's nice," and then told me Melissa had received early acceptance into a pre-med program. I remember standing there with the newspaper in my hands, feeling the pride drain out of me. I almost asked her to be happy for me, just for 1 minute. But I already knew what the answer would be. That night, I cut out the article and placed it in the same drawer as the ribbon, the certificates, and every other piece of myself my family had taught me to hide. Looking back, I think that was when I began to understand that there were two versions of me. There was the Claire my family saw. Quiet, unimpressive, too sensitive, not enough. And there was the Claire I became when I held a camera. Patient, focused, certain, alive. I built my life around the second one. It did not happen quickly or easily. I worked small jobs, photographed birthday parties, school events, engagement shoots, and anything else that would pay. I learned editing software late at night, saved for better lenses instead of vacations, built my own website, and answered every client inquiry as if it might become the door that finally opened. By 29, I had become a wedding photographer in Boston. There was an irony in that. I spent my life capturing families at their happiest. Mothers fastening gowns, fathers wiping tears, sisters holding hands before the ceremony, relatives gathering close because love was supposed to mean showing up. Through my lens, I saw the tenderness I had always wanted. Maybe that was why I became so good at photographing it. I knew what absence looked like, so I understood the value of presence. Then I met Ben Carter at a wedding outside Boston, on a warm September afternoon, while golden light spilled across a field of wildflowers. He was not the groom or part of the wedding party. He was just a guest in a navy suit, crouching in the grass to tie a little boy's shoe, while everyone else posed for pictures. The boy looked embarrassed, and Ben whispered something that made him laugh. I lifted my camera without thinking and took the photo. That was the first image I ever captured of the man who would become my husband. I did not know that yet. All I knew was that he had the kind of kindness that did not perform for attention. And after a lifetime of being unseen, I had learned to notice people like that. I took the first photo of Ben Carter before he ever noticed me. He was not the groom, not a groomsman, not anyone important to the schedule I had been hired to follow. He was just a guest in a navy suit, crouching in the grass to tie a little boy's shoe, while the rest of the wedding party posed beneath strings of warm lights. The boy looked embarrassed, his cheeks red, but Ben whispered something that made him laugh. I lifted my camera without thinking and pressed the shutter. There was something about him I noticed immediately. He did not perform kindness. He simply practiced it. He helped an elderly woman find her seat without making a show of it. He carried cupcakes for a group of children who were clearly negotiating for more than one each. He listened when people spoke, even when they were saying ordinary things. In my family, warmth was often something displayed in public and withdrawn in private. Ben's warmth did not feel like that. It felt natural. Near the end of the reception, while I was packing one of my lenses, he came over with a cup of lemonade and set it beside my camera bag. "You've been working all night," he said. "I figured photographers need fuel too." I looked up, surprised. "Is that your way of saying I look exhausted?" "It's my way of saying you made my nephew look angelic in at least 3 photos, which is basically a miracle." I laughed before I could stop myself. It was an easy laugh, the kind I rarely had around people I did not know well. He introduced himself as Ben Carter, a 4th-grade teacher from Cambridge. When I told him I was Claire Hammond, he repeated my name like it mattered. We talked for longer than I expected. Most people asked about cameras, prices, or how long it took to edit a wedding album. Ben asked what I looked for when I photographed people. I told him I watched for the moments no one planned. A mother fixing her daughter's veil, a groom's hands shaking before the vows, a child falling asleep under the dinner table after dancing too hard. "So you notice what everyone else misses," he said. I smiled, but the words landed deeper than he knew. Being noticed had never been easy for me. Being understood was even rarer. Our first date was at a small cafe near the Charles River. I arrived early, nervous enough to consider leaving, but Ben walked in with a crooked smile and a book tucked under one arm, and somehow the room felt less sharp. He spoke about his students with a seriousness that surprised me. There was one boy who struggled with math, but could draw entire comic strips from memory. A girl who barely spoke in class, but wrote beautiful poems in the margins of her worksheets. Ben did not talk about them as problems to fix. He talked about them as people waiting to be understood. Kids bloom differently, he said. The mistake is thinking they're failing just because they don't bloom the way adults expected. I stared at him for a moment. In the house where I grew up, there had only been one acceptable way to bloom. Melissa had done it perfectly. I had spent years believing I was defective because I could not become her. With Ben, I did not feel measured. That was new. We began seeing each other often. He learned the strange rhythm of my work. Weekends spent at weddings, weekdays buried in editing, late nights answering emails from brides who wanted one more photo adjusted. I learned that he kept thank you notes from former students in a shoebox, cooked 3 meals well and repeated them proudly, and cared more about being useful than being impressive. The first time he visited my apartment, he stood in front of the wall where I had hung my favorite photographs. He was quiet for so long that I grew self-conscious. "Too much?" I asked. "No," he said. "Every photo feels like it has a secret." That was the closest anyone had come to understanding what I wanted my work to do. Ben never pushed me to talk about my family, but he noticed the effect they had on me. He noticed how formal my voice became when my mother called, how tense I was after visiting my parents, how I seemed to shrink whenever Melissa's name entered a conversation. One night, he saw an old photo on my phone. Melissa in the center with a trophy, my parents smiling around her, and me blurry in the corner holding a certificate. I tried to make a joke of it. "Find the shadow." Ben did not laugh. He looked at the picture carefully, then asked, "Did they always make you feel like you were standing outside your own family?" The question was too accurate. For years, I had softened the truth. My parents were busy. They were strict. They had high standards. They did not understand me. But Ben had named it plainly without making me feel foolish for having endured it. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe, but they're still my family." He reached for my hand. "I'm not asking you to stop loving them. I just hope one day you stop believing their blindness says anything about your worth." That was the first time I cried in front of him. A few months later, I brought Ben home for dinner. I told myself it was the natural next step because we were serious. But deep down, I still wanted my parents to approve of someone I had chosen. I wanted them to look at Ben and see what I saw. Steadiness, patience, decency. I wanted one part of my life to pass their test. Dinner was served in the formal dining room beneath my mother's chandelier. Melissa was there too, still in her hospital clothes, with her boyfriend Andrew, a surgical resident. My father asked Andrew about his specialty before the salad was finished. My mother praised Melissa's schedule as if exhaustion itself were an achievement. Ben remained polite. He complimented the meal, asked thoughtful questions, and answered honestly when my father turned to him. "So, Claire says you teach 4th grade," Richard said. "I do," Ben replied. "This is my 7th year." "And is that long-term?" my father asked. "Or do you plan to move into administration? Something with more advancement?" Ben smiled calmly. "I've thought about it, but I love being in the classroom. That's where I feel I can make the most difference." My father nodded, but I knew that expression. He had already placed Ben into a category. Respectable enough to tolerate, not impressive enough to value. "A man should think seriously about providing," Richard said. Heat rose in my face. "Dad," Ben's hand found mine under the table. He did not squeeze to stop me. He squeezed to steady me. "I understand," Ben said, "but I think teaching provides something important too. It just isn't always measured in salary." The table went quiet for half a second, before my mother redirected the conversation back to Melissa and Andrew. That was how my family dismissed people. Not always with open cruelty, but by making them irrelevant. After dinner, my mother caught me near the kitchen. "He seems kind," she said. "He is. But kindness is not a plan, Claire." I looked at her, stunned by how quickly she could reduce a good man to a warning. "He has a career," I said. "He has a job. she corrected. There's a difference. I wanted to tell her that Ben made me feel safer than that entire house ever had. I wanted to ask why ambition mattered more to her than tenderness. But I had spent too many years keeping peace by swallowing the words that would have protected me. On the drive home, I apologized. Ben kept his eyes on the road. You don't have to apologize for their arrogance. The word was sharp, but it was true. My parents had not misunderstood him. They had judged him and found him beneath the life they thought I should want. For the first time, I was not ashamed of the person I loved. I was ashamed of the people I had wanted to impress. Ben reached across the console and took my hand. Claire, I don't need them to respect me, but I need you to know you don't have to earn your place with people who keep moving the doorway. I held his hand all the way back to my apartment. That night, after he left, I sat in the quiet and looked at the wedding photographs on my wall. Mothers holding daughters, fathers wiping tears, families leaning close because love was supposed to mean showing up. I had spent years photographing that kind of love from the outside. With Ben, I had finally found a piece of it for myself. And that terrified me, because choosing him might mean giving up the approval I had chased my whole life. Ben proposed on an ordinary Saturday morning, which somehow made it perfect. We were in his backyard, sitting beneath the old maple tree with 2 mugs of coffee between us. I had stayed up late the night before, editing a wedding album, and my hair was still pinned messily on top of my head. There was no restaurant, no hidden photographer, no dramatic music, just Ben, the pale morning light, and the quiet steadiness that had made me trust him in the first place. He became unusually silent. Then he set down his mug, reached into his jacket pocket, and lowered himself onto one knee. Claire, he said, his voice soft but certain, I don't want to build a life where I only get pieces of you between weddings, edits, and everything you think you have to carry alone. I want all of it. I want us. The ring was simple, a small diamond on a thin band. It was not the kind of ring my mother would have admired or shown off at one of her charity events, but when Ben looked up at me, I felt something more valuable than admiration. I felt chosen. I said yes, before he finished asking. For a few days, I let myself be happy without guarding the feeling. Ben's parents cried when we told them. His sister immediately offered to help with flowers. My friends from the photography world started sending ideas for lights, music, handmade signs, and table arrangements. Everyone around us responded with the kind of easy joy I had always imagined families were supposed to give. Then I called my mother. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone in my hand, rehearsing the words until they sounded stiff. Ben stood nearby, not interfering, just present. I told myself this was good news. A daughter was engaged. Her mother should want to hear about it. When Evelyn answered, her voice was brisk. Claire, is this urgent? I'm between meetings. I swallowed the hurt and forced brightness into my voice. Ben proposed. We're getting married next June. There was a pause. Not joy, not surprise, just a pause. Well, she said finally, that's news. We're planning something small, I continued. In Ben's backyard. It'll be simple but beautiful. I really want you and Dad to be there. June is difficult, she replied. The hospital calendar is full, and your father may have a conference. Send the details. We'll see what we can do. The call ended with no congratulations from my father. No question about the ring, no warmth. Just the familiar sound of my hope being placed on hold. Still, I made the invitations myself. I chose cream-colored paper, pressed tiny wildflowers between heavy books, and wrote every name by hand. Ben helped tie thin pieces of twine around the envelopes while I addressed them. When I reached my parents' invitation, I slowed down. For them, I added a note. I know this is not the kind of wedding you may have imagined, but it would mean everything to me if you were there. I sealed the envelope before I could overthink it. The replies came in slowly at first, then quickly. Ben's family said yes. My Aunt Karen promised to come early and help with flowers. Uncle Jack left a voicemail saying he would not miss it for anything. Friends wrote little notes in the margins of their RSVP cards. From my parents, nothing. Melissa sent one short text. Congratulations. Hope planning goes well. No mention of attending. No question about the date. It felt less like a sister celebrating my engagement and more like a coworker acknowledging an announcement. For weeks, I checked my email and phone more often than I wanted to admit. I told myself my parents were busy. I told myself they would respond when the date got closer. But 2 months before the wedding, the silence became too heavy to keep excusing. I needed the truth, even if it hurt. So I drove to the house where I had grown up. The place looked exactly the same. Trimmed hedges, polished windows, brass numbers beside the door. Inside, the air smelled like lemon polish and fresh flowers. My mother was in the living room with a cup of tea and a stack of papers beside her. My father sat in his leather chair, reading glasses low on his nose. I came to talk about the wedding, I said, holding another copy of the invitation because I needed something to do with my hands. My father removed his glasses. We received it. You never responded. He cleared his throat. That weekend won't work. I stared at him. Won't work? Melissa and the children will be visiting, my mother said. Their schedules are difficult, and we've already made plans. It's my wedding, I said. My mother's expression tightened, as if I had embarrassed her by stating something obvious. Claire, everyone has obligations. Melissa's life is not easy to rearrange. Can't she visit another weekend? I asked. Just this once? My father leaned back. Your sister's responsibilities are not as flexible as yours. There it was again, the old comparison, spoken like common sense. I tried one last time. I'm not asking you to rearrange your lives for months. I'm asking you to come watch me get married. My mother set her tea down carefully. Claire, you and Ben have chosen a very modest ceremony. That is your decision. But you cannot expect everyone to treat a backyard wedding as if it were some major family event. I felt my chest tighten. It is a major event to me. To you, perhaps, she said. But this is not exactly the kind of occasion that defines our family. My father's voice came next, calm and final. Your mother is right. A wedding like this is a waste of time for someone like you. For a moment, the room went silent. Someone like you. He did not shout. My mother did not correct him. They sat there as if the sentence had been reasonable, as if my wedding, my future, my happiness were something small enough to dismiss over tea. I looked down at the invitation in my hand. Cream paper, pressed flowers, my careful handwriting. I had made it with hope, and suddenly that hope felt humiliating. I thought, I said quietly, that just once you might want to be there because I'm your daughter. Neither of them answered. That silence hurt more than an argument would have. It told me there was nothing left to explain. I placed the invitation on the coffee table. Okay, I said. My mother frowned. Claire, don't be dramatic. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and something inside me settled. I had spent years trying to make my pain small enough for her comfort. I was done. I'm not being dramatic, I said. I'm done asking. Then I walked out. No one followed me. No one called my name. The front door closed behind me with the same heavy sound I had known my whole life, but this time I did not stand there hoping someone would open it again. When I got home, Ben was waiting in the kitchen. He saw my face and crossed the room without asking questions. I let him hold me. I cried, but not because I still believed they might change. I cried because I was finally accepting that they probably would not. They're not coming, I said. I'm sorry, he whispered. I pulled back and wiped my face. Don't save seats for them. Ben studied me carefully. Are you sure? I thought of my father's voice, my mother's teacup, and the invitation lying untouched on their coffee table. Yes, I said. If they don't want to see me, I'm not leaving empty chairs for the people who chose not to come. That night, I opened the seating chart and deleted their names. Then I deleted Melissa's. The front row looked smaller afterward, but more honest. For the first time since the proposal, I stopped planning a wedding my parents might respect and started planning the one Ben and I actually wanted. The morning of the wedding was quieter than I expected. I had spent 2 months preparing myself for pain. I thought my parents' absence would follow me through the entire day, sitting beside me during the ceremony, standing behind me in every photo, whispering that I still had not been chosen. But when I woke up in the guest room at Ben's house and saw sunlight moving across the curtains, the first thing I felt was not grief. It was peace. The backyard looked exactly like the wedding we had imagined. Strings of lights hung between the trees. Wild flowers filled mason jars on wooden tables. A narrow aisle of white petals led to the old maple tree, where Ben had proposed. It was simple, personal, and warm. Nothing about it was designed to impress my parents, and for the first time, that felt like freedom instead of failure. Aunt Karen arrived early to help me dress. She moved around the room with calm hands, fixing the lace at my shoulder, adjusting my veil, and pretending not to cry when she saw me in the mirror. "You look beautiful, Claire," she said. There was no comparison in her voice, no mention of Melissa, no quiet judgment about the dress, the venue, or the guest list. Just the words every bride deserves to hear. When Uncle Jack came to walk me down the aisle, he stood awkwardly in the doorway for a moment, as if he knew the place he was filling carried more weight than either of us wanted to say. "I know I'm not your father," he said. I looked at him and felt my throat tighten. "No," I said. "You're the person who came." His eyes softened, and that was enough. When the music began, I took his arm. Out of habit, my eyes moved toward the front row, but there were no empty chairs waiting for Richard and Evelyn. I had removed them from the seating chart. The people sitting there were the ones who had chosen us. Ben's parents, his sister, Aunt Karen, close friends, and a few relatives who had never made me feel like an afterthought. The row was smaller than the one I had once imagined, but it was honest. Then I saw Ben. He stood the maple tree, in a gray suit, trying not to cry, and failing. The moment our eyes met, the ache in my chest loosened. My parents had called this day a waste of time, but Ben looked at me like my arrival was the most important thing that had ever happened to him. The ceremony was short and imperfect in the best way. A child laughed during the vows. The flower girl dropped too many petals in one spot. The microphone crackled once and made everyone smile. Ben promised to never make me feel like I had to earn my place beside him. I promised to choose our life not because it erased my past, but because it gave me somewhere safe to build beyond it. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the applause rose around us like sunlight. For the rest of the afternoon, I let myself enjoy what was real. I danced barefoot in the grass. I laughed with friends under the lights. Ben's mother hugged me so tightly I almost lost my balance. Jack gave a toast about how family is sometimes defined by the people who keep showing up, and for once, I did not feel the need to defend the ones who had not. There were moments when I felt their absence. During photos, I noticed the missing shape where my parents should have been. During dinner, I wondered if my mother had thought about me at all. But each time the thought came, someone present pulled me back into the day. Karen touched my arm. Ben smiled across the table. A friend handed me cake. The love in front of me was not perfect, but it was there. By the time we reached the small inn where we would spend our wedding night, I was exhausted and happy. Ben loosened his tie, dropped onto the edge of the bed, and said, "That was the most perfectly imperfect wedding I've ever seen." I laughed and sat beside him. For a while, we talked about the day in small pieces: the flower girl, Jack's toast, his mother crying, the way the lights looked after sunset. Eventually, Ben fell asleep with one arm across my waist. I should have slept too. Instead, I reached for my phone. It was an old habit, one I had not fully broken. Some part of me still wondered if my mother had sent a message. Not an apology, maybe not even congratulations, but something to prove she had remembered. I opened Facebook because there was a notification from her profile. The first photo made my body go still. My father stood on a beach in Hawaii, wearing sunglasses and holding a drink. My mother stood beside him in a white linen dress. Melissa was there too, laughing with her children in front of the ocean. The sky was bright, the water impossibly blue, and everyone looked happy. The caption read, "Perfect vacation with the people who matter most." I stared at those words until they stopped looking like words. The people who matter most. I scrolled through the photos, a resort balcony, a dinner table by the beach, my father raising his glass, my mother smiling beside Melissa. The timestamps made the truth clear. This had not been a sudden trip. It had not been unavoidable. They had planned it before my wedding and chosen not to tell me. They had not missed my wedding. They had replaced it. The pain came cold and sharp. All day, I had tried to believe their absence did not control me anymore. But seeing them celebrate somewhere else, with Melissa, under that caption, made the wound feel deliberate. They had looked at my wedding and decided a vacation with my sister mattered more. Ben stirred beside me. "Claire?" I tried to answer, but no sound came out. He sat up, saw my face, and reached for the phone when I handed it to him. He read the caption, looked through the photos, then placed the phone face down on the nightstand. "I'm so sorry," he said. That was all he needed to say. I cried then, not because the wedding had been ruined, but because a part of me had still hoped they might care in some quiet, hidden way. The photos ended that hope. They showed me exactly where I stood. Ben held me until the shaking passed. He did not tell me to ignore it, or focus only on the good parts. He let it hurt. After a long silence, he said, "They chose that. But today, the people who love you chose you." I knew he was right. The day had been beautiful, the love had been real, but I also knew something inside me had changed. I reached for my phone again. For a moment, I thought about blocking all of them. My mother, my father, Melissa. But I was too tired to make a final decision from a fresh wound, so I did the only thing I could do that night. I turned the phone off. Then I placed it face down on the table and moved closer to my husband. "I don't want them to take this from us," I whispered. "They won't," Ben said. I closed my eyes, but I did not sleep for a long time. Behind my eyelids, I kept seeing the beach, the drinks, the smiles, the caption. Yet beneath the hurt, something harder began to form. My parents had shown me who mattered most to them. Now I would have to learn how to matter to myself. The next morning, I woke up beside Ben with my phone still turned off on the nightstand. For a few seconds, before memory returned, I felt only the quiet weight of his arm around me and the softness of the room after a long, emotional day. Then the images came back. My parents on a Hawaiian beach, Melissa laughing beside them, the caption about the people who mattered most. The pain was still there, but it had changed overnight. It was no longer sharp enough to ruin the wedding. It sat somewhere deeper, like a truth I had finally stopped arguing with. Ben did not push me to talk about it. He ordered coffee from the inn's tiny kitchen, helped me pack my dress into its garment bag, and kissed the top of my head before carrying our bags to the car. We were supposed to leave for Cape Cod that morning, and for once, I wanted to go somewhere my family could not reach me. Cape Cod was not the kind of honeymoon my mother would have respected. There were no luxury suites, no private tours, no perfect photos staged for social media. We stayed at a small inn near the water where the floors creaked. The breakfast was homemade, and the ocean could be heard from the open window. It was exactly what Ben and I wanted. For the first few days, I let the quiet heal what it could. We walked along the beach in sweaters, collected shells like children, and ate clam chowder at a small restaurant where the owner remembered Ben from a childhood vacation. I took photos of ordinary things, his footprints beside mine in wet sand, Gulls circling over fishing boats, sunlight turning the water silver in the late afternoon. Every time I raised the camera, I felt myself returning to my own life. I checked my phone only once a day. Most messages were from friends thanking us for the wedding or sending photos they had taken. There was nothing from my parents, nothing from Melissa. After the Hawaii post, their silence did not surprise me anymore. It almost made sense. They had said what they needed to say, without speaking to me directly. On the 7th morning, Ben went downstairs to get coffee, while I stood near the window, watching fog roll over the beach. My phone vibrated on the small wooden table. I expected another message from a client or a friend. It was my father. For a moment, I simply stared at his name. Richard Hammond. I had not spoken to him since the day he called my wedding a waste of time. My first instinct was to let it ring. Then the old habit rose up, quiet but powerful. Maybe something had happened. Maybe he was calling because he had seen the wedding photos. Maybe, somehow, he had realized what they had done. I answered. "Claire," he said immediately. His voice was tight, urgent. "Finally, we have a serious problem." No congratulations. No mention of the wedding. No apology. I felt my body go still. "What problem?" "The Madison property," he said. "The loan is in trouble. The bank has sent notices, and if we don't bring the account current, they may move toward foreclosure." The Madison property. I had not thought about it in months, though maybe I should have. 3 years earlier, my father had asked me to co-sign a loan for one of his investment properties. At the time, he had presented it as a simple formality. He had good credit, he said. The property was stable. The rental income would cover the payments. He only wanted my name added to strengthen the application. I had been nervous, but he knew exactly what to say. "This will show me you're responsible, Claire," he had told me. "You want to be treated like an adult? This is how adults build trust." I had signed because I was still hungry for one thing from him. Approval. Not money, not praise in public, just the feeling that my father saw me as capable. I told myself the risk was small. I told myself he would never endanger me. Now his voice was in my ear, and the old signature felt like a trap closing. "How far behind is it?" I asked. "There have been some delays," he said quickly. "Unexpected expenses, vacancies, issues with the management company. The details don't matter right now. What matters is that we need $40,000 to stop this from getting worse." I gripped the edge of the table. 40,000? Yes, immediately. The fog outside the window blurred against the glass. "Why are you calling me?" "Because your name is on the loan," he said, as if I had forgotten. "If this defaults, it affects you too. Your credit, your financial future, everything. I'm trying to protect all of us." The word protect nearly made me laugh. He had not protected me from the bank. He had not protected me from public humiliation. He had not protected me from seeing my family celebrate in Hawaii on my wedding day. But now, when his investment was failing, he wanted to talk about protection. "What happened to the reserve fund?" I asked. "A pause. It was used," he said. "For what?" "Claire, this is not the time to interrogate me. I'm telling you what needs to happen. You have savings. Your business is doing well. You and Ben had a modest wedding, so I assume you didn't waste much there. Transfer the money, and we can discuss the rest later." The words hit harder than I expected. Even now, he could not resist reducing my wedding to a financial detail. Even now, he spoke as if my savings existed for his emergency. "I just got married," I said, my voice lower than before. "I'm aware." "Are you?" He exhaled sharply. "This is not about your feelings, Claire. This is about responsibility. Family helps family." There it was. The sentence people used when they wanted sacrifice without accountability. I looked down at my left hand. My wedding ring caught the gray morning light. Just 1 week earlier, I had stood in front of the people who loved me, while my parents raised glasses in Hawaii. Now, my father was calling from whatever disaster he had created, expecting me to clean it up because my name was useful to him. The old Claire would have panicked. She would have asked for the transfer details, opened her bank app, and convinced herself that saving him might finally make him grateful. That version of me still existed somewhere, but she sounded farther away than before. "I need time to look at the documents," I said. "There is no time." "Then you should have called me before it became an emergency." His silence was brief, but I felt it. He was not used to me answering that way. "Do not make this difficult," he said. "You signed the loan. You have an obligation." I said I need time. "Claire, I'll call you back." Then I hung up. My hand shook as I lowered the phone. For the first time in my life, I had ended a call with my father before he was finished speaking. It should have felt rude. Instead, it felt like air entering a room that had been sealed for years. Ben came back carrying 2 coffees and stopped when he saw my face. "What happened?" I told him everything. The Madison property, the missed payments, the $40,000, the way my father had spoken as if the money were already his. Ben listened without interrupting. When I finished, he set the coffees on the table and sat across from me. "Do you have the loan documents?" he asked. "Somewhere in my files at home." "Then before you send anyone $1, you need to know the truth. Not his version, the actual truth." I nodded, though my chest was tight. Part of me was terrified. If the loan was collapsing, my credit could be damaged. My business plans, my studio, everything I had built could be affected. But beneath the fear was something stronger than panic. Suspicion. My father had given me urgency, but not answers. He had demanded trust without earning it. He had called it family, but it felt more like a bill arriving after years of emotional debt. I turned toward the window again. The fog had begun to lift, revealing a thin line of ocean beyond the beach. For the first time since I answered the call, I breathed fully. "I'm not sending the money today," I said. Ben reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "Good." I looked at my phone, still warm from my father's call. A week ago, I might have mistaken his panic for my responsibility. But I had walked past 2 empty chairs. I had seen Hawaii. I had read the caption. I knew what I was to them when I needed love, and what I suddenly became when they needed money. This time, before I saved anyone, I was going to find out what had really happened. I waited 2 days before calling my father back. Not because I needed more time to decide. By then, I had already made my decision. The lawyer had shown me the records. The missed payments had started months earlier, not recently like my father claimed. The reserve fund had been drained. The dates matched too perfectly with the Hawaii trip for me to pretend it was a coincidence. My father had not made one desperate mistake. He had made a series of choices, and when those choices became dangerous, he reached for me. I sat in my studio that afternoon with the Madison documents spread across my desk. Outside the window, Boston traffic moved steadily through the gray light. Inside, everything felt strangely still. My phone rested beside my laptop. Richard's name stared back at me from the screen. For most of my life, calling my father had made me feel small before he even answered. I would prepare my voice, soften my words, and make sure I did not sound too needy, too emotional, or too difficult. This time, I did none of that. I pressed call. He answered on the second ring. "Claire, finally. Have you arranged the transfer?" No greeting, no question, no room for anything except obedience. "No," I said. The silence on the other end was immediate. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean I'm not transferring $40,000. His voice sharpened. "Do you understand what you're saying? Your name is on that loan. If this collapses, it damages you too." "I understand exactly what I'm saying." "No, you don't," he snapped. "You're being emotional because of the wedding, and this is not the time for childish resentment." My hand tightened around the phone, but my voice stayed calm. I spoke to a lawyer. I reviewed the payment history. You missed 5 payments, not 2. The first one was months ago. He said nothing. I continued. I also saw where the reserve money went. His breath changed, just slightly. You had time to book flights, I said. You had time to pay for the resort. You had time to take Melissa and her children to Hawaii. But you didn't have time to warn me that a loan with my name on it was falling apart. That trip has nothing to do with this, he said. It has everything to do with this. Claire, listen to yourself. You sound bitter. For a moment, the old instinct rose in me. The urge to defend myself. To explain that I was not bitter, not jealous, not dramatic, not selfish. I had spent years trying to prove my feelings were reasonable to people committed to dismissing them. This time, I let the accusation pass. You told me my wedding was a waste of time, I said. Mom said it too. Then you spent that same weekend on a beach with Melissa, posting about the people who mattered most. He exhaled sharply. This again? Yes, I said. This again. Because 1 week after you made it clear I didn't matter enough to show up for, you called me like my savings belonged to you. It is not about your savings. It is about responsibility. You signed the loan. I signed because you told me it would prove I was responsible. You used my need for your approval to put my name on your risk. That is an outrageous thing to say. It's the truth. His voice dropped into the tone I knew best, the controlled one that always made me feel as if I were the problem. Family helps family, Claire. I looked down at the papers on my desk. Late notices, bank letters, numbers that could damage my future because I had once trusted him. No, I said. Family doesn't hide a financial disaster until they need someone else to pay for it. For the first time, he sounded genuinely angry. If you refuse, you will regret this. Your credit will suffer. Your business could suffer. Do you really want to destroy your own future just to punish me? I'm not punishing you. I'm refusing to rescue you. You are turning your back on your own blood. I almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. You turned your back first. At my wedding. That was different. Of course it was, I said. When I needed love, it was different. When you need money, it's family. He went quiet. That silence told me I had finally said something he could not easily rearrange. I took one slow breath. I'll deal with the consequences of my signature. I'll work with the bank. I'll protect myself however I can. But I will not cover the $40,000. I will not drain my savings to make your choices disappear. You're making a terrible mistake. Maybe, I said. But it will be mine. Then I said the sentence I had carried since the night I saw those photos. Don't call me about things you said were worthless. I ended the call before he could answer. For several seconds, I sat perfectly still. My hand was shaking now, but not from fear alone. There was grief in it, and anger, and something that felt almost like relief. I had imagined that saying no would make me feel cruel. Instead, it made me feel awake. Ben came to the studio after work and found me sitting at the desk with the phone still in front of me. It's done, I said. He did not ask if I was sure. He only sat beside me and took my hand. I expected the silence from my family to last longer. It did not. By the next morning, my aunt called. Not Karen, but one of my mother's sisters. The kind of relative who appeared at holidays with strong opinions and no interest in context. Claire, what are you doing to your father? She demanded. I closed my eyes. What did he tell you? That he is facing a serious financial situation, and you are refusing to help out of spite. Your mother is devastated. Melissa says you've been acting jealous and unstable since the wedding. There it was. The story had already been rewritten. By noon, 2 cousins had texted. By evening, an uncle left a voicemail saying I should be ashamed. No one asked why my father needed the money. No one asked why I had refused. They had accepted the version that made me the selfish daughter and my parents the victims. Melissa called that night. I almost ignored it, but some part of me wanted to hear what she would say when no one else was listening. Her voice was cold from the first word. I hope you're proud of yourself. Hello to you too. Dad is under enormous stress, and you're using this as some revenge fantasy because Mom and Dad couldn't make it to your little wedding. My little wedding. The words landed, but they did not cut as deeply as they once would have. Maybe because I had finally understood that Melissa had been raised inside the same story, only from the winning side. You don't know what happened, I said. I know enough. You've always acted like everyone was against you. Maybe if you stopped being so sensitive, people wouldn't have to walk on eggshells around you. I looked at the Madison papers still stacked beside my laptop. Did Dad tell you the payments were months behind before he called me? She paused. Did he tell you he used the reserve fund while my name was still attached to the loan? Another pause, shorter this time. That's not the point. It is exactly the point. No, Melissa said. The point is that family helps family. I felt tired then. Not defeated, just tired of hearing the same sentence from people who had never used it when I was the one hurting. Then where was family on my wedding day? She did not answer. I gave her a few seconds. Then I said, I'm done being useful to people who don't know how to love me. I ended that call too. That night, I did something the old Claire never would have done. I gathered every document Margaret had sent me. The missed payment history, the bank notices, the reserve account records, and the public screenshots from Hawaii. I put them in order, clean and simple. No long emotional speech. No begging anyone to believe me. Then I wrote one email. Subject: The truth about Madison and Hawaii. I explained the timeline in plain words. I stated when the payments stopped, when the Hawaii charges appeared, when my father called me, and what he demanded. I did not insult them. I did not defend every year of my childhood. I only attached the facts. At the end, I wrote one line. Decide for yourself who abandoned whom. I sent it to every relative who had called or messaged me. Then I closed the laptop. My hands were still trembling, but my breathing was steady. For the first time, I had not let my family define the story and trap me inside it. I had answered with proof. The replies did not come all at once. Some people stayed silent because silence was easier than admitting they had judged me too quickly. But a few messages arrived before midnight. A cousin wrote, I didn't know. An uncle replied, This changes things. Aunt Karen called and left a voicemail that simply said, I'm proud of you. I listened to that one twice. My parents did not respond. Melissa did not respond either. But this time, their silence did not erase me. I had told the truth. I had protected myself. And even if the whole family never understood, I knew one thing clearly now. I would never again pay for love with my peace, my money, or my silence. After I sent the email, I expected my family to explode. I expected my father to call and accuse me of betrayal. I expected my mother to write something cold and polished. I expected Melissa to say I had finally gone too far. But for the first time in my life, their silence did not frighten me as much as it used to. Some relatives never responded. They had been loud when they thought I was selfish, but quiet once the documents made that story harder to defend. A few sent short messages. One cousin wrote, I'm sorry. I didn't know. An uncle admitted, Your father left out a lot. Aunt Karen called and said, You did the right thing, Claire. Refusing to be used is not cruelty. I saved that voicemail. The bank situation was still complicated. Margaret helped me negotiate, review documents, and protect myself as much as possible. There were forms, tense phone calls, and several nights when I sat at the kitchen table staring at numbers that could damage the future I had built. But even when I was scared, I was no longer obedient. I had made a mistake by signing that loan years ago, but I would not make a second mistake by paying for my father's choices just to keep the peace. Ben stayed beside me through all of it. He did not take over or treat me like I was fragile. He made coffee, sat across from me while I read legal letters, and reminded me to eat when stress made food feel impossible. That was one of the first things our marriage taught me. Real love did not always arrive as grand speeches. Sometimes it looked like someone staying at the table while you faced the mess. Still, saying no did not erase the old wounds. I could protect myself and still miss the father I wished I had. I could expose the truth and still feel sick when my mother's name appeared in my inbox. I could choose myself and still grieve the family I had spent my whole life trying to earn. That was why I finally walked into a support group at a small community center in Boston. The sign on the door read, "Family Estrangement Support Group, you're not alone." I almost turned around. The words felt too final. But then a woman near the entrance smiled and offered me a seat, and that small kindness kept me there. For the first hour, I listened. A man spoke about a father who only called when he needed money. A woman described being compared to her sister until she stopped knowing what she wanted for herself. Another person said they had spent years confusing guilt with love. I sat there hearing strangers say pieces of my life out loud. When it was my turn, I told them about the wedding, Hawaii, the loan, and the $40,000. No one interrupted. No one called me dramatic. No one asked what I had done to deserve it. They simply believed me. Therapy came next. Dr. Harris helped me name patterns I had spent years excusing. She did not tell me to hate my parents, and she did not pressure me to forgive them. She helped me understand that boundaries were not punishments. They were rules for how someone could remain in my life without harming me. You are not responsible for making your parents comfortable with the consequences of their choices, she told me. I wrote that sentence down. Slowly, my life became quieter. Not empty, just quieter. I stopped checking Melissa's social media. I stopped answering unknown family numbers out of fear. I stopped explaining myself to people who were already committed to misunderstanding me. The space my family had occupied began to fill with work, friendship, marriage, and ordinary peace. My photography business grew during that time. Couples recommended me because they said I made them feel safe. I understood why. I knew what it meant to want one important day, protected from people who could ruin it. I knew how valuable it was when someone showed up without needing to be begged. A year after the wedding, I opened a small studio with white brick walls, soft curtains, old cameras, and framed prints from the weddings I had loved most. When I hung the sign that read Claire Dawson Photography, I stood outside for a long time just looking at it. For years I had waited for my parents to tell me my work was real. That day, I realized I no longer needed them to. Then, one morning, everything changed again. I found out I was pregnant in the upstairs bathroom, holding a test with 2 pink lines while Ben was still asleep. Joy came first. Fear came right after it. What if I became like my mother? That question scared me more than anything. I knew what it felt like to be a child measuring every word, every achievement, every expression, trying to become worthy of love. I could not bear the thought of giving that pain to my own child. When I told Ben, he lifted me into his arms and laughed with such pure happiness that fear loosened for a moment. Later, when the house was quiet, I admitted the truth. "I'm scared I'll repeat it," I said. "What if I become cold without noticing?" Ben took my hand. "The fact that you're afraid of that means you're already different. Your mother never questioned the harm. You are questioning everything because you care." That night, I bought a yellow notebook. On the first page, I wrote a letter to the baby I had not yet met. I did not promise to be perfect. I promised to be present. I promised to listen, to apologize when I was wrong, and to never make love feel like something that had to be earned. The last line mattered most. "You will never have to prove you are worth loving." Our daughter Lily was born on a rainy November morning. She arrived furious and loud, with tiny fists curled near her face. When the nurse placed her on my chest, I cried so hard Ben had to wipe my cheeks because I would not let go of her. In that moment, I understood something simple and enormous. A child does not arrive owing anyone achievement, obedience, or gratitude. A child arrives already deserving love. Motherhood was not perfect. There were sleepless nights, unfinished laundry, and days when I felt like I was failing at everything. But every time Lily cried, I picked her up. Every time I lost patience, I came back and repaired it. Every time fear whispered that I might become Evelyn, I reminded myself that love was not proven by perfection. It was proven by presence. My parents did not meet Lily right away. After her birth, Evelyn sent a short email saying they hoped we were well. Richard's name was added at the bottom. I read it once and closed the laptop. A softer tone was not the same as change. When Lily's first birthday approached, I made a decision I never expected to make. I invited them. The invitation came with clear rules. They could come if they respected our home. No comments about money, no criticism of Ben, no comparisons to Melissa, no rewriting the past. They could attend as grandparents, not as judges. Evelyn replied the next day, "We understand. Thank you for inviting us." I did not fully trust it, but I no longer needed trust to keep myself safe. I had boundaries now. They arrived on time with a small wrapped gift. My body tensed when I saw them, but they did not sweep in like they owned the room. My mother looked older. My father looked less certain. They thanked us for inviting them and stayed near the edge of the party while Lily smashed frosting into her hair, and Ben laughed helplessly beside her. No one mentioned Hawaii. No one mentioned Madison. No one apologized either. But for the first time, my parents entered my life without taking control of it. Later, while I carried Lily upstairs for her nap, my mother appeared at the nursery doorway. She stopped there and waited. "She's beautiful," she said quietly. I looked down at my daughter, already half asleep against my shoulder. "She is." For a moment, I thought my mother might say more. The old me would have waited desperately for an apology hidden inside her silence. This time, I did not reach for it. "I'm going to put her down now," I said. Evelyn nodded and stepped back. That was when I knew I was free. Not because everything had been repaired. Not because my parents had finally become the people I needed. Not because Melissa understood or the past no longer hurt. I was free because their silence no longer decided my worth. That night, after the guests left, I stood in the living room, among paper plates, ribbons, and half-deflated balloons. Ben wrapped his arms around my waist. "How do you feel?" he asked. I looked at the room, messy and warm and real. I thought of the empty chairs at my wedding, the Hawaii caption, the $40,000 demand, and the phone call where I finally said no. Then I thought of Lily sleeping upstairs in a home where she would never have to perform for love. "I feel free," I said. And I meant it. My parents once taught me that love had to be earned. I built a life that proved them wrong.